right, guys. Hi, everybody. So great to see you. I always forget how bright it is on these stages every time. I don't know why I don't remember. I've actually had a pretty crazy last few days, and I'll spend a couple of minutes talking about it. I was invited to this conference called Food for Thought in Zurich, Switzerland, and it was hosted by this insurance company called Swiss Re. And the purpose of this conference was to have the low-carb experts and the standard academic nutritional experts from all over the world come together and see if we could find any common ground. So they had all of your usual familiar doctor faces there, Eric Westman, Jeffrey Gerber, Andreas Einfeld, and I was fortunate enough to be there amongst many others. I got to meet Gary Taubes. It was like the highlight of my life so far. Sorry to my husband. No, I'm just joking. I think he was just as excited to meet Gary also. But all of these, they're standard traditional, the policymakers, the people who decide what these guidelines are, what you should be eating, how often you should be eating, academics and physicians from all over the world, like Oxford, Harvard, Cambridge. We were all in one room together, and no one got punched in the face. It was pretty spectacular. But we agreed on some common things. We agreed that diabetes is a completely reversible condition through lifestyle change, which is really cool. We also came to the agreement that, hey, we should all probably cut down on sugar across the board, which was huge, huge thing for us to find common ground on. So saturated fat was another thing that we seem to have reached some common ground on too. These people, these anti-saturated fat physicians are now coming around to the idea that, yeah, it's not that bad. You know, when we review the literature, it's not the enemy. It actually could be beneficial. Now, the kinds of saturated fat, that's still up for debate, but that was really fantastic. And what was even aside from all of this, something that was very common was that we just eat too much and we eat too often. So I was actually scared about being a controversial expert there in the world of therapeutic fasting, but it was actually pretty neat to hear everyone, no matter whether you were on the high-carb spectrum or the low-carb spectrum, saying we just eat too much and we just eat too often. So I'm Megan Ramos, and I'm a clinical researcher by trade. I direct the Intensive Dietary Management Program. My disclosures are that I co-own the program with my colleague in crime, Dr. Jason Fung. So this is just funny, and I show it sometimes. So I've worked with Jason for 20 years. So since I'm going to be 34 this August, I started working with him when I was a kid. He was also a kid. And we started working together. I've been plagued with metabolic history my whole life, and it was when I got diagnosed with diabetes that I was not going to die from diabetes, and there was going to be a way. And we had already been experimenting with low carb. So that's why my head stuck on this guinea pig. I was the first N=1 of the IDM program. And so again, that's another disclosure. My bias is that I helped reverse so many of my negative metabolic conditions through our initial fasting protocols. So the initial protocols we started implementing with patients. So the Intensive Dietary Management Program, or most people know us as IDM program. It's funny because half the people in our program don't even know what IDM stands for. We were founded in June of 2013. June 5th, 2013 is when I saw my first patient for fasting. We're based in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and our initial purpose for IDM was to treat obesity and type 2 diabetes. Since then, we've evolved into looking into the uses of therapeutic fasting for other conditions. So Dr. Fung and I founded this therapeutic fasting program about 5 years ago now. Today, I'm not going to share too much of our data with you. We're in the process of organizing our data and publishing a bunch of case reports. We recently published a case report in the Journal of Insulin Resistance. But our 5-year data will be presented this October in Houston, half of it, and then all of our 5-year data, or it will be 6-year data at that point, will be presented in Denver next March. So today I'm going to talk to you about our patient demographics, because that's why we thought fasting might be a solution. We'll talk about selecting the appropriate fasting regimen. Most people want to know what works best, what is going to help them the most. So depending on their lifestyle, their medical issues, a whole bunch of factors. So I know a lot of you guys, I get messages on social media, I get emails. This is what my life is like. This is, what I'm struggling with. What should I do? So we'll talk a little bit about how we select the fasting regimen that we use in different patient populations, and I'll run through those protocols. And then I'll address a few common concerns that people often have about intermittent fasting and extended fasts. So the numbers. We launched in June of 2013. In clinic, we've treated over 5,000 patients. We do have an online program, so we work with people from all over the world as well. So in total, we worked with over about 8,000 individuals in the last 5 years. We focus on various ranges of fasting, time-restricted eating windows, so fasting even between lunch and dinner, and just not snacking. Or intermittent fasting protocols, where you fast for a day, eat for a day, fast for a day, eat for a day. Or extended periods of fasting, where you might fast for 2 or 3 days, or even several days at a time. Most of the patients we've worked with have had some degree of diabetes, whether it was pre-diabetes, borderline diabetes, or they were full-out diabetics. We've had that particular diabetic came in with an A1C that was so high, it was undetectable on the lab. It was way over 15%. She was on 600 units of insulin, 3 different kinds of insulin. She was on diamicron, maximum dosage, Onglyza, metformin, and Victoza. So we have the full spectrum that we treat at IDM. Less than 10% of our patient population are healthy individuals. Hey, I'm 26. I've got this family history that's utterly horrendous for diabetes and metabolic syndrome. Right now, I'm healthy. Can you help me stay that way? So a lot of times I get these emails saying, hey, Megan, is fasting just for sick people, or can healthy people fast too to maintain their good health? Absolutely. And it's just about selecting the appropriate regimen for you. So our typical IDM patient profile. So when we talk about what we see in clinic versus the healthy patient population, what you should be doing to maintain good health is different. So most of the patients we treat in clinic are over the age of 40. We do have 17 patients that are between the age of 19 and 21. A lot of our patients are very sick, so they're very sedentary. A lot of our patients have some degree of metabolic syndrome and are on medication for hypertension and dyslipidemia as well. And our patients at least have one secondary side effect of diabetes. So why fasting? What the heck? Why fasting? Why would we do something that seems so radical, even though human beings did it for thousands of years? Well, when we started IDM, we tried to do low carb. Low carb was less radical. Eating less sugar was less radical than just not eating at all. But we had a whole lot of issues trying to get our patients to eat better. So I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with the city of Toronto, But the city of Toronto is the most culturally diverse city in the entire world, which is something I'm super proud of. It's also one of the largest cities in North America. We sort of oscillate between Los Angeles and Toronto for number 3 in terms of population size. So we're a massive metropolitan area, a big megacity, and big megacities tend to be pretty expensive. And if you visited Toronto, we have terrible public transport. So it's pretty difficult to sort of go to the suburbs if you don't have a vehicle and get good quality food that's relatively inexpensive. So a lot of our patients, they're very sick. They have different socioeconomic challenges. So many of our patients are on disability. That means they either get somewhere between 700 and 900 Canadian dollars a month to live. With our initial patient population of 80 patients, almost all of them, over 80% of them, were on some form of disability, meaning they were getting somewhere in the range of $700 to $900. The average cost of living for these individuals was $2,200. So they were either relying on friends or family or having to live with friends and family to be able to make ends meet at the end of the month. A lot of our patients were newcomers to Canada. Just over 50% of the population of the city of Toronto are new to Canada. So they're just looking to get established. They may be able to be financially sufficient on their own, but a lot of the times they're living with relatives, trying to get established, trying to get degree programs from their previous countries transferred to Canada and do different bridging programs in order to be able to be a doctor in Canada or be a nurse in Canada or a computer engineer in Canada, software engineer. So there's certain hoops, and education, as we all know, is quite expensive nowadays. So people, a lot of our patients, we live in the most, or Jason and I work in the most diverse part of this very diverse city. So we see a lot of these newcomers in our clinic. So low carb wasn't always possible. 2 summers ago, a head of cauliflower was $10. So for patients who can barely make their bills and have to depend on relatives to help them get by each month, they felt awkward, uncomfortable, or just flat out couldn't ask for the support to eat better quality foods. But the one unique thing about this was that most of them, because they were newcomers to Canada, had done some sort of fasting in the past, mostly for religious purposes. Now, every major religion in the world incorporates fasting for some reason. So I grew up in a very non-religious family, and I always thought it was more for spiritual reasons. And one of the things that actually made Dr. Fung and I say, what is this about fasting? Is he had a friend who was fasting for spiritual purposes, but ended up losing weight and dropping her blood sugar levels down. And then that made him think of our patients that participate in Ramadan every year. And these patients in Ramadan, they lost weight, their blood pressure went down, their blood sugars went down, their A1C improved during Ramadan. The solution was always there in front of our eyes, and we were actually used to always be irritated about it because these patients would all have to come in, we'd have to adjust all their medications because they were just going to get better for 30 days, and then 2 months later, when they started resuming normal standard North American diets, they would get sick again. So a lot of our patients were open-minded to fasting. So when we would approach them about it in clinic, they'd say, oh yeah, we're Hindu. We grew up fasting this many days a week, this often. Or, oh yeah, we're Muslim. We do Ramadan every year. So that's like 30 days of fasting, and it's dry fasting from sunrise to sunset. So you just want me to fast for 24 hours with lots of water, tea, and coffee? I'll gladly do that. So people were very willing to do it. And, if you sort of look at me, I was the first person to fast. And I'm like 8th generation Canadian. I was born in 1984. I grew up in the era of low-fat foods where we were told to eat all of the time. I came from fortunate circumstances, so I had access to lots of food. But fasting wasn't even that radical for someone like me in my demographic, because my best friend growing up was Hindu and fast twice a week. I saw all these patients participating in Ramadan, and I knew they didn't die. They just got better during this time. So fasting sometimes is just easier. Sometimes it's easier not to eat than it is to eat right. And if you're someone like me who had these cultural ties to food that were quite significant, it takes a long while to figure out what to eat. And when you have certain behavioral aspects that are related to how much you eat and what kinds of food you eat, like stress eaters, I learned to stress eat at an early age from watching my parents cope with stress through food and other family members cope with stress through food. These are real behavioral things, and you're definitely able to change these and develop better habits over the long term. But sometimes we would see a patient who was just so sick in clinic, we didn't have time to wait till they could make these significant behavioral changes. We didn't have time to wait for them to figure out how to make foods that are so foreign to them and so the opposite of everything that they grew up with within their own culture. It was just easier not to eat. And we could get dramatic improvement by skipping meals here and there and enable the patient to have time so they don't have to stress out so much about making these changes. And also, by not eating, these patients saved a lot of money. So is there hope for them to eat better foods, especially the socioeconomically challenged population? Well, absolutely. So we have them fast. We can help cure their illnesses. But through fasting, they were able to save money. And through saving that money, they were able to buy better quality foods. So it was a win-win. By fasting, we solved our initial problem that the patients can afford to buy better quality foods. So we had them eating less, improving their conditions, requiring less medications, saving money from that even. Now in Canada, we're exceptionally fortunate, but there's still things that we have to pay for. And when you're literally counting pennies at the end of the day to try to make sure your bills are paid, those pennies matter. Those little things add up. And I'll never forget the first patient that came in, and he cried because he could afford a ribeye for like the first time. So he wasn't doomed to buying really economical foods like rice and potatoes and pasta. Food in Toronto is really expensive. Transportation to the outskirts where it's cheaper is not very convenient, especially for sick individuals who are very immobile. So what do we do first? A lot of people email me and ask me, do we focus on the low-carb or ketogenic diet before fasting? Or do we focus on the fasting first and then the keto or low-carbohydrate diet? Most people assume that fasting would be easier if you're in a ketogenic or a low-carb state. And it is absolutely easier. If you can get your body into fat-burning mode, and it will make it a lot easier for you to fast if you're already in a state of ketosis. But again, sometimes certain individuals we see in clinic are very sick. Most of the individuals we see in clinic are very sick. They're literally hanging off of the cliff. It's do something now, or in 6 months from now, you're going to lose that foot. You don't have a whole lot of time with these individuals to really work on their diet. So they can stop eating today. And so with a lot of our patients in our program, we actually start with the fasting first. The fasting really reduces the insulin level, which reduces ghrelin, our primary hunger hormone, substantially. So it gives these patients the ability physiologically to make better choices. When your hunger hormones are through the roof, you want to eat all of the time. And you want to eat certain things all of the time, mostly carbohydrates. So when you fast, you suppress these hormones. So it makes the carbohydrates less attractive when you're not as hungry. So the fasting gives people back control. So if you're not in a hurry, you don't have to jump into fasting. You can absolutely start off with a low-carb or ketogenic diet first, get into a state of ketosis, start burning body fat, and then implement fasting. But if you really want to make a dramatic impact because you're concerned about the immediate effects of metabolic syndrome or obesity, then it's perfectly safe. And we have a lot of success with fasting. The majority of our patients fast, and we work with their diet over time. Like I said earlier, it takes a while to move away from these cultural things. I slowly weaned off of pasta. I'm an Irish-Italian girl. It took me like 4 years to wean off of it, slowly. These things are hard. You have emotional ties to them. It's not that you're just used to eating them. They are of cultural significance to you. And behavioral things, learning to cope with stress. Finding different ways to celebrate successes that don't always focus around food. Finding different activities to participate with your husband or your partner with that don't always focus around food. These behavioral strategies take time to develop. So with our patients, we tend to really push them in the deep end with fasting first, and then work with them on various strategies to tackle what they eat, what kind of behavioral issues that they might be struggling with, too, with non-desirable eating habits. So what do we treat with therapeutic fasting? So I've already talked about obesity and type 2 diabetes, but we're also utilizing our IDM program to experiment with different areas of medicine where therapeutic fasting might be beneficial. So non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, we've seen dramatic improvements in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. I was actually diagnosed with fatty liver disease at the age of 12. I was a toothpick. No one understood the term TOFI yet. Thin on the outside, but fat on the inside. And I was a chunky little sack of fat. But I was a little sack of fat, so people didn't care. My BMI was less than 18. Apparently, I was underweight, but I was all fat. So they told me I'd grow out of it. Well, I never grew out of it until I started fasting and going low carb at the age of 27. And I reversed all of those years of fatty liver disease within 6 months. Polycystic ovarian syndrome. We've now had a couple dozen IDM babies. We're losing track. We'll have all these all these younger women with PCOS that have been told that they're going to struggle with fertility, who haven't been as cautious with taking preventative measures. As a result, get really upset. 4 to 6 months into our program, they'll say, "Your program's screwing us up because we haven't had our period." And I say, "Well, maybe take a pregnancy test. Let's order a pregnancy test." There's no way I could be pregnant. They told me that from day one. And well, now we have these oodles of IDM babies, which is really cool. Sleep apnea is sort of something that's pretty cool. Now, there's different causes of sleep apnea, but some sleep apnea can be caused via insulin resistance, so too much insulin in the body. And we know that fasting reduces insulin levels. So we've actually taken about a dozen patients off their CPAP machines. They no longer need their CPAP machines, which is kind of nice. It's nice if you don't have to sleep with a CPAP machine. So we primarily focus on a lot of diseases of too much insulin in the body and insulin resistance. But we're experimenting with certain things, various cancers, and the use of therapeutic fasting in conjunction with low-carb or ketogenic diets. Tumor growth. I have a bunch of women who have pituitary tumors in a position that makes them think that they're pregnant, so they can't get pregnant, and they're always lactating. So we have this group of women fasting, and we're measuring, every year we're doing annual MRIs, assessing whether or not fasting is having an impact on the size of this pituitary tumor that they have. Various neurological conditions, diabetic neuropathy, multiple sclerosis, and Parkinson's disease. A lot of these conditions have been shown to improve with a low-carb or ketogenic diet. So how much more could they potentially improve with the use of fasting? And various autoimmune disorders. We have our first fully reversed case of colitis, ulcerative colitis. So that's been really interesting. And we're starting to work with high-performance athletes. I currently work with a dozen of them. One of the more prominent ones that talks about fasting publicly is George St. Pierre, or GSP. He's a UFC fighter. He's a pretty important guy and a fellow Canadian. And he was actually diagnosed with ulcerative colitis, and he talks about this very publicly. And we started doing some fasting with him, and he's doing pretty great. He was sharing his progress update on a recent episode of Joe Rogan. All right, so what is considered therapeutic fasting? So fasting can be very mild or it can be very extreme. Patients benefit a lot just from time-restricted eating, so just limiting the number of times a day that they eat. So sometimes we'll have patients just simply cut out snacking and try not to eat late at night, and just by doing that alone, they see dramatic weight loss and dramatic reductions in their blood sugar levels. Sometimes we just skip one meal a day. We either skip breakfast or dinner and eat breakfast and lunch or lunch and dinner. So we'll do sort of a 16-8 or an 18-6 diet. And then our intermittent fasting regimens. This is what we try to work everyone up to. Now, fasting is like a muscle. Sometimes people are just naturally a little bit more stronger and a little bit more adapted to doing weight training, and sometimes people aren't. I'm one of those who isn't so much. So you have to start off somewhere. So if you're very new to fasting and you're not quite sure where to start, try cutting out snacks and just simply focusing on breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And once that becomes comfortable, then cut out breakfast or dinner and see how you do on 2 meals a day. And if that starts to become comfortable and feels quite easy, then try an intermittent fasting regimen. So patients will do 24, 36, or 42 hours of intermittent fasting, and we have found that the best frequency of these fasts when you're trying to treat a condition is 3 times per week. We really like to try to drive home the fact that fasting is a therapeutic treatment. It can be a lifestyle for a healthy individual to incorporate some fasting and to maintain their good health, but we really encourage our patients to think of fasting as a therapy. Prolonged periods of fast are something we recommend periodically. They're not something that we recommend people really do all of the time. Most of the prolonged fast is usually 2 or more days. Most people do sort of 5-day or 7-day fasts. In our clinic, we cap patients somewhere between 7 and 14 days, ask them to break a fast, and then resume eating. The odd time the patient goes rogue on us. I do have a gentleman who's really into an extended fast, close to 80 days right now, and he's doing pretty well. But that's not something we would really recommend. Usually patients would fast somewhere between 7 and 14 days. We would stop them and have them eat. And even then, we'd only recommend that a few times a year. So how to select the right fasting regimen? Medical considerations. So a 24-hour intermittent fast tends to work better for men than women. Learning how to develop your fasting muscle through doing 24-hour fasts is great for women who are struggling with fasting, but women really don't get as much results as their male counterparts, especially if you're a woman who has a history of chronic long-term use of low-calorie diets. So a 24-hour fast is generally pretty safe for the entire population to do, whether you're looking to do it for disease prevention, or if you're looking to just lose a few pounds, you have borderline diabetes, you're not really on any diabetic medication. We'll also shy on the air of caution and use 24 hours of fasting for patients who are very ill, so patients, for example, who would be on dialysis. 36 and 42-hour fasting, intermittent fast periods are usually our gold standard. It's where we like to work our patients' fasting muscles up to and to being able to do comfortably. Extended fasts, again, we would only ever use those periodically. So a 36 or 42-hour fast is something that we would encourage patients to do if they're looking to lose more than 30 pounds, if they're a diabetic on medications, but were otherwise not very medically complicated. They haven't had any recent history of congestive heart failure, they're not on dialysis, and they're otherwise healthy. For individuals who are looking to maintain their health, we have them fast about 1 to 2 a week, but for patients who are looking for therapeutic benefits of fasting, we have found that 3 times a week is the optimal frequency. Mental considerations to take into account when deciding what fasting regimen is right for you. A history of negative body image. These patients that we've worked with tend to get a little bit too obsessive compulsive with it. So patients who have a history of being bullied or being put down for their weight and their health issues over the years, we tend to have them start simply by taking a more gradual approach and cutting out snacking and slowly reducing the meals, because we don't want them to go overboard and try to do something like an extended 5 or 7 day fast to start. Similar with patients who have addictive or have a history of addictive behaviors or substance abuse. They tend to take the fasting a little bit to the extreme. So we would prefer to start them off slowly and build up healthy fasting habits. Family history of sort of extreme poverty. I work with several people who grew up, one of them grew up during the Vietnam War in Vietnam, and he suffered as a child from severe malnutrition. There was intense periods of famine throughout his childhood, and he really struggled with a little bit of post-traumatic stress from his upbringing. And then there are several American patients that I work with who sort of grew up on food stamps and lived in large families, and food was always really scarce. So with these patients, we tend to cautiously approach extended fasts with them and encourage them just to communicate with us about how they're feeling, so we're aware of what's going on in terms of their stress. Emotional eating and coping. If patients are going through a particularly stressful time when we meet them in consultation, that determines our fasting regimen. Fasting doesn't inhibit or doesn't create that much stress on the body. It doesn't really make your body have too much of a cortisol reaction or a stress reaction. But when you're already experiencing extreme levels of stress, fasting might just tip it over the edge a little bit too much. So if the person who comes into our consultation is going through something very traumatic or very stressful in their lives, we would start off by fixing their eating windows first before we would start any significant fasting. And once life calms down, then, of course, we will extend the fast. And similarly for people who have been fasting for a long time, one day, something bad might happen, and it might throw off their situation for the next few months. Life might be very stressful, and then we would focus on time-restricted eating windows and good eating habits and behaviors, rather than focusing on doing a lot of fasting. Lifestyle considerations. Your work environment, what's that like? Do you have high expectations to attend lunch meetings and dinner meetings all of the time? Is your work very stressful, and is there lots of food around? So maybe for people who work in these really stressful environments and find their homes to be much more relaxing, then maybe it's better that these individuals would fast on weekends rather than weekdays. So what schedules could we fit in for them on weekends or days that are less stressful for them? And also, again, their level of stress. Family support. Sometimes patients' spouses or children are absolutely petrified by the idea of them skipping one meal a day. Sometimes it actually causes marital issues if one spouse really wants to try something a little bit more extreme. So it's about finding a balance between what is going to make everyone happy and healthy and limit the amount of stress that it's inflicting on their families. Also, patients with younger children, sometimes patients are really sort of worried about the impact of them not eating for extended periods of time, maybe in front of their young daughters and their sons, and how that might impact their body image and their eating habits. So they're not too keen to fast in front of their family. So how can we fit fasting in with their work schedule a little bit more? And also coming up with strategies that work well for the chefs, the cooks of the family. We also focus on their activity level. If there's someone who's weight training a little bit more, who doesn't have as much body fat, we would fast them less and encourage them to eat more protein than the very sedentary patient who's not exercising and is stuck on the couch because of their medical complications. So with them, we would restrict protein a little bit more and encourage more fasting. So fasting is not a one-size-fits-all Fasting is not one size fits all. Sorry, guys, I'm super jet lagged. There's many factors to take into consideration when you're fasting, and you don't always have to do the same thing all of the time. That's the beauty of it. And as you heal metabolically, your body changes. I've had 7 different metabolic personalities over the last 7 years. And what worked for me when I was sick and diabetic and extremely overweight is very different than what works for me now as a healthy, fit individual. So my tolerance for carbohydrates is much higher than it used to be when I had diabetes and was quite overweight. My tolerance, or my protein requirements are much higher because I'm weight training 5 days a week now, 4 or 5 days a week, because I have the energy to do so when I didn't have the energy to do so when I was obese and diabetic. So what works for you at one point is probably not going to work for you at another stage. And I've implemented several different regimens, dozens of different regimens throughout my own personal journey alone. So additional dietary recommendations. So sometimes our patients can't go low carb or ketogenic. So fasting is a great alternative to at least cut down on the amount of carbs that you're eating and how often you're eating them. But we really encourage our patients to at least eliminate the refined carbohydrates as a minimum. Ideally, we'll have our patients do a combination or some variation of from liberal low carb, sort of more of a paleo low carb diet, to ketogenic diets. People who are very active with a healthy body composition, who are just looking to maintain their health, we encourage a little bit more protein consumption in them than we would in our sedentary metabolic patient. So those patients we would have take more of a moderate to low protein diet. And absolutely no snacking. I have patients that eat like total garbage. And that's not because of their choice. Some people literally don't have that option. I have patients with amputated arms and amputated legs, and they can't cook, they can't go to the grocery store. It's difficult for them. McDonald's is easy. Burger King is easy. They just hand the person the money and they get a bag and they're done. But when you have an amputated arm, it's hard to cook, it's hard to prepare foods for yourself. And government assistance home care is really not all that great. So sometimes they just totally eat like garbage, but we get decent results with them just by limiting the number of times a day that they're eating this garbage. We've managed to take many people who can't go low carb still off their diabetic medications and improve their diabetes just by focusing on time-restricted eating and cutting out all of the snacking. So what can patients consume during a fast? The gold standard is water. A pure fast is a water-only fast, and we usually encourage some sodium consumption as well. Patients who are looking to just sort of treat their diabetes and lose some weight, we do encourage bone broth, especially if the patient is going to be doing more of an extended fast. And I do understand people seek out extended fasts for the benefits of autophagy, but usually during certain points throughout an extended fast, day 5 or day 7, we'll encourage our patients to at least have some bone broth to really reduce the risk of refeeding syndrome. Most of us aren't malnourished, and refeeding syndrome's not much of a risk, but it's always better to err on the side of caution. Magnesium is something that we usually supplement as well in our patients. Most metabolic patients have magnesium deficiency. Most in North America has magnesium deficiency, so that's something we encourage on a fast. And then for patients who are looking to just, again, treat their diabetes and lose weight, tea and coffee, preferably black. We limit the amount of fat depending on the duration of the fast that they can add. Usually we encourage patients not to have more than 2 to 3 tablespoons of fat on a fasting day, but we really encourage black tea and black coffee. So common fasting concerns, most of them are around electrolyte imbalances, refeeding, lean mass, and metabolic rate. So I know I'm running out of time, so I'll go through these quickly. So electrolytes, sodium, magnesium, potassium, calcium, phosphorus. Most of people online, they want to try to find the perfect combination. And I see all these guides. Like, if you're fasting for these many days, take this much sodium and this much potassium. And a lot of it is nonsense. You know, we've never prescribed fasting to one patient, or no, sorry, we've never prescribed potassium to one fasting patient in clinic. Never, ever. As in addition, some of them might be taking potassium supplementation already because of other medications that they might be on, like prednisone or other healthcare conditions that they have, but we've never recommended it. If you're getting adequate sodium, your body will retain adequate potassium. In terms of magnesium and calcium and phosphorus too. Magnesium is usually a standard recommendation of about 400 milligrams a day. We usually recommend magnesium glycinate, malate, or citrate, depending on the patient's digestive issues. Calcium, though, and phosphorus maintain really stable throughout a fast. So we don't even worry about those, unless, again, you're doing extended fasts. We'll encourage people to have a little bit of bone broth periodically, which is higher in calcium and phosphorus, just to prevent against any refeeding issues. So the rule number one when it comes to fasting is just exercise common sense. Don't fast someone who's malnourished. But most of us aren't malnourished when we start fasting. This is Angus Barbieri, and he fasted for just an insane number of days. He fasted for 382 days, and he lost a nice chunk of weight there. He drank water, and every few weeks he had some electrolyte IV injections. But if you look at his plasma calcium and phosphorus levels, they remain pretty steady throughout the duration of his fast. Initially, you'll see the magnesium levels drop, but then they stabilize. So who is at risk for refeeding syndrome? So there's a lot of doctors out there who are really concerned about it. But then again, here in North America, we don't have a whole lot of issues with being malnourished. So people who have low calcium, phosphorus, really low sodium, potassium, magnesium levels at baseline, having a lot of these low electrolytes can put you at risk for refeeding syndrome. Also, extremely sedentary individuals are at risk for refeeding syndrome. So if you want to prevent against refeeding syndrome, it's not going to happen with intermittent fasting. It's only something that's potentially a risk for long-term fasting. So just be active. Get up. Go for a walk a couple times throughout the day. Maintain your regular chores. Don't stay in bed and be sedentary during your fast, thinking that's less stressful for the body. It's actually more stressful for the body. So refeeding syndrome, it usually occurs within 2 days of after ending an extended fast. And the main electrolyte, that's the biggest issue, is phosphorus. But most of us don't really have phosphorus deficiencies. So we check this at baseline. And it's only really an issue for those patients who are malnourished. So prevention again, if you're going to do extended periods of water fasting, break it up with some bone broth, stay hydrated during your fast, take your sodium and your magnesium, and keep up with your regular activities. The loss of lean mass. So this is the bottom line, is that we need more data on this. So in clinical observation, Jason and I are going to share some of this data because we've been collecting it. So we'll share it in March in Denver. But we have a patient, she's 53 years old. She's been fasting for the last 2 years. Once a month, she does a 4-day fast, and then she alternates between 16 and 24-hour fasts the remainder of the month. She does quite intensive weight training twice a week. She follows a ketogenic diet, and she adjusts her protein up a little bit because of her weight training. So she did 2 DEXA scans, 2 DEXA body composition scans, and she did them about 4 months apart. And within this 4 months, she only lost a little bit of body fat, but she gained 4.1 pounds of lean mass. So these are the observations that Jason and I are seeing in clinic all of the time. So we're going to publish some of this data and share it with you soon. This is a randomized control trial from 2018. It assessed the differences between alternate daily fasting versus caloric restriction. So the patients in the calorie restriction group had their calories reduced by 400 calories a day. The patients who did alternate daily fasting had 0 calories a day. They just drank water, and they did this over the course of 32 weeks. So on this table here, you'll see sort of the differences between total fat mass percentage loss in the calorie restriction group between the alternate daily fasting group. Now, the alternate daily fasting group lost 2.4% body fat, total body fat, whereas the calorie restriction group only lost 0.7% body fat. We saw the same trends in terms of trunk mass. So trunk is your tummy area, your midsection, where we have all that unwanted and unhealthy fat. We also saw some cool results in terms of the development of lean mass. The alternate daily fasting group increased their lean mass by 2.2%, whereas the calorie restriction group only increased their lean mass by 0.5%. Another major concern is what happens to your metabolic rate when you're fasting. Well, comparing the adjusted metabolic rate for the calorie restriction group versus the alternate daily fasting group, we only saw a very tiny reduction in the metabolic rate, the resting metabolic rate, in the alternate daily fasting group. It only decreased by 29.2 kilocalories per day. Whereas the calorie restriction group, it decreased by 76.1 kilocalories per day, which is statistically significant. Okay. So I only have a few seconds here. So me being the first guinea pig, I've lost in total 86 pounds. As an adult, though I've been 186 pounds and I've been obese, and I've been 97 pounds and I've been obese, and at 115 pounds, I'm the healthiest I've ever been in my life in terms of body composition. So my background is I was skinny fat. So just because you're thin on the outside does not mean that you're not fat on the inside. So I was a skinny fat kid with fatty liver and PCOS. I was told I was infertile pretty much in my early 20s. Well, in my early 30s, I'm more fertile than most teenagers. So that's been kind of neat. I became obese though at the age of 26. I went up to 61% body fat. I was diagnosed with diabetes, and I was given the diagnosis of osteoporosis. 27 was not a good year for me, not at all. So I started fasting, doing 24-hour intermittent fasts. Then I went up to 42 hours on Mondays and Wednesdays, and I stuck to 24 hours on Fridays. And then I went up to 72 hours, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and then I often did a 24-hour fast on Friday. And I did this for 6 months. And over the course of the 6 months, I first eliminated refined carbs, then I went moderate low carb, and then eventually towards the end, I started experimenting with ketogenic diets. And I didn't eat all day on my eating days. I only ate in 2 90-minute eating windows. I cut out breakfast and I stopped snacking. It nearly killed me because I grew up in the era of grazing and always being 2 hours behind in your day. Like, I didn't have time to make a meal. I was always rushed. It was grab this, grab that, and a lot of that, eating those carbohydrate foods are so easy to grab this and grab that. It takes a little bit more effort. So at 6 months, I had lost my 60 pounds. I hit my target weight by losing 60 pounds, and I realized I was still pretty fat, even though at that point I was only about 120 pounds. So I had a body scan done, and that was a very sobering experience to see that I was still about 40% body fat, even with a 60-pound weight reduction. So I encourage everyone to really know and learn what their body composition is and track body composition over weight. I reduced my A1C to 4.6%. I had absolutely no fatty liver, and I started having a regular menstrual cycle without having to take any sort of medication that would stimulate that to occur. 6 years later, I'm down sort of today I'm down a net of 80 pounds. My A1C earlier this year when I last checked it was 4.5. Still no fatty liver, still no PCOS, and I have osteopenia. Hopefully by the time I'm 35, I'll have some normal bones and do that in reverse. So if you want to learn more about our program, here are some cool ways to check us out online. And we have a podcast called the Obesity Code Podcast. So I'm sorry for going over. So I think I'm supposed to take about questions for about 5 minutes. I'm sorry again, I'm a little bit jet lagged. So please bear with me here for a second. Does anyone have any questions?
Ladies and gentlemen, we don't have time for questions. Okay. I'm sorry. However, Megan Ramos will be over at the table for the speakers. You can meet with her and have questions answered there. So, round of applause for Megan Ramos, please.